So we've got f6. Are you white or black, Mr. Ning? Do you guys see what opening black's playing? The Black Redeemer Gambit with black. That's pretty exciting. Good choice of games. All right. So you're basically playing the Black Redeemer Gambit, right? Like white could play knight f3, and you could play e5, takes, and play this position. Cool. But your opponent played e3, and you get to play e5 for free. So now right off the bat, you've really taken over being white. You've got a nice big advantage. Blind Dragon, did I get your game too? I got a game from Michael 00. How did you send me your game, Blind Dragon? On what platform? On chess.com or on Lichess or where? So now bishop to b4 check. In chess.com messages? Okay, cool. Should be there then. Yep, I've got a new message with your game here. Yep. Cool. All right, so we got plenty of material now for today. Thank you, all three of you. All right, so here we are, bishop g3. So this bishop b4 check move, that doesn't strike me as a good move here. I don't see the point or advantage of it. I'll say that in general, in f-pawn openings in which you move your f-pawn, you usually want to cover with knight f6 as soon as possible, this kind of thing. Additionally, in this position, your d5 pawn is under some fire. So knight f6 is also useful for sustaining this point here. So I would definitely play knight f6 without much thought here. I'll say that. It covers the two things that I'd be most worried about at the moment. In general, you want to remember that when you play these f6 openings, or f3 as white, it weakens your control over these two squares for the moment, right? Because you don't have knight f6 for the moment. So your opponent can go for counterplay against those squares. So you want to take the first opportunity you can to rectify that by covering d5 more. All right, so bishop b4 check, c3, bishop d6. In this position, can't white take your pawn on d5? See, you might think like c3 is not like a useful developing move for white. No harm, no foul in playing bishop check and then just going here. You haven't lost any time, right? You moved your bishop. They moved their pawn. So basically you got your bishop out for free. But the problem is, yes, you developed a piece, but you didn't develop in the right order. And so you left d5 hanging, right? Exactly the square which I was saying you have to be careful to watch in this particular opening. So you really need to keep this square defended, which means the only square you can go to with your bishop is this, which still makes some sense, but you're better off bringing out your knight and then deciding what to do with the bishop, and keeping these things covered so that your opponent doesn't have as many options. So your opponent didn't go after d5, he went after h5. And now you got a chance to play knight f3, and you are comfortably on top again. Okay, I mean, this move is huge, right? Like, when you don't play it, your opponent could play queen d5, and it's like winning for white. Once you do play it, not only do they not have queen takes d5 winning, but they have a very significant disadvantage. Your position is way better than white's because of the center advantage, and even a little bit of development advantage. So as long as you keep the main weak square, vulnerable square in your center covered right now, you will have an undisputable advantage. And here you're threatening bishop g4, winning his queen, so he loses another tempo. This move is just so strong, right? I mean, do you realize that such simple moves can be so good for you? e4, which seems to work out very well as in this position, seems good. I mean, I like to keep my pawns next to each other, as you guys know. So I would also be strongly tempted by just developing. Like, e4 looks good, but I would wonder if this move might not be just as good, because you developed a piece. Well, you not only got your king out of the center, in one move you put your rook on the open f-file. So also, in f-pawn moving openings, castling is a better and better move, or a more and more important or impactful move than in other openings. And here, because of the rook on the queen, what you're kind of threatening is to play knight e4. And it doesn't look like white has any great ways to prevent you from doing that, really. Maybe queen d1 is their best move. But like if they play knight d2, for example, you can still play knight e4. And you attack the queen and you send her back like this, and then you can take, and you know, maybe post your queen here. You know, the odds are good that this is really strong for black as well. So after castles, I think the threat of knight e4 probably forces queen d1 defending this. And now I probably just bring out another piece. And now I'm threatening knight e4 again. So maybe knight d2 and then d4. Something like this. And you've just developed super, super fast. It seems very strong. This is another option. Your king a bit in the open because you've had to play g6. Yeah, your king's a little bit vulnerable, but because of the number of active pieces that you have compared to white, your king won't be in any practical danger until later in the game if you make mistakes. But for the moment, it won't be a factor. Right? Weaknesses are only weaknesses if your opponent can attack them. And the best comfort that you can have with weaknesses is when your opponent has no active pieces. If their pieces aren't active, you know nothing terrible is going to happen to you. But now let's look at e4, which is probably very strong as well. But the point of e4 should be, and you don't quite follow up on it, the point of e4 should be to take on g3, I assume, and weaken white's pawn structure. However, I would keep in mind that after putting your pawns on light squares, we're then trading the dark square bishop. So you've hurt white's pawn structure, but actually you've left yourself with a bishop that's not very active, and you don't have a piece to really attack these, to follow up on the weaknesses you've created. So e4 is not as strong as, for example, ABR 2015 thinks it is. I mean, it's not bad. This isn't bad for black, but this is not as amazing and crushing as your instincts are telling you it is. Yeah. I mean, I guess like the best way to actually like make this logical is probably to follow up by attacking g3 like as hard and fast as you can, like knight here, knight e2, and then queen d6. Just going straight after this. If king f2, then you castle kingside and chase him off of here. So now maybe you achieve like here, forcing this weakness, and you check, and you get your queen in, and you castle, and something like this. So we can actually win control over the g3 square like this as black, and we can even win a pawn. However, we're using all our advantages and all our energy to achieve this. So in the end, once you get here, and let's say I play like queen g1 maybe, just to give us a sample position. In the end, once you get to this situation, you've traded all your advantages for this one extra pawn, and you have an endgame that's not going to be that easy to win with this bishop versus this bishop. Okay? It's an advantage for you. It's just not as good as you think. Well, if this move, then here, right? If queen g5 instead of queen d6, then you can't get past g4. And you can either sack your knight with queen e3, pawn takes knight, right? Or you can retreat your knight and white plays queen d2, and you're back to step one as far as building up an advantage. I'm not very convinced of the piece sack either. And presumably it's like this, trying to threaten this, which doesn't even do anything because the king can just get away. And I don't know, a check here, knight d2, threatening queen e4. This is not completely convincing me. So honestly, I prefer, having looked at both, I prefer castling with the idea of playing knight e4, taking on g3, and keeping my dark squared bishop. And if the only way they can deal with that is with queen to d1 variation, bishop e6, defending this point more, so I can play knight e4 without queen d5 check. And then knight d2, stopping knight e4. And now I can play this move d4 with white 3 moves away from castling. I prefer this. I think this looks significantly more crushing. And, you know, there might be other options here as well, like knight h5. So now this is quite a threat, because I'll still have the bishop, and I'll have queen g5 and e4, possibly. But if they play this, now you go for queen f6, threatening queen f2. And if knight f3, your plan is to play e4 and just take on f2 anyway. This is a typical tactic in the King's Gambit, and also in the Black Redeemer Gambit that we were looking at the other day, right? The idea of like threatening this move or this move to break through on the f file that you have open early before white has castled and gotten their rooks involved. So do you see how this variation here is stronger and smoother than the variation with the quick e4, where maybe you win like one pawn, but you trade off every good piece in your position and your opponent survives? What we're doing here is more killer, because we're keeping all our positional advantages and we're continuing to develop quickly. So it may be a little bit of a close call and hard to evaluate all these positional advantages versus like that clear pawn win that we came up with e4. But I think this is better. And I think an engine would say so too. And engines like pawns, but I think an engine will also recognize that the advantages that I'm building up here for black are tremendous. You know, there's also a line f3, queen h4, which isn't good for white. All right, cool. Well, the important person in the audience, Mr. Ning, has come through saying that he also likes what I'm doing here for black better, and he would also want this position. So let's carry on with the game. After e4, queen d1, I'm a little surprised to see bishop e6, because I thought your whole point was to take here and create this weakness. Because if not, why play e4? Right? E4 weakens your pawn structure, gives white a d4 square. And after bishop e6, you know, he can trade the bishop here. And leave you with like not that good bishop and some weaknesses on d4 and f4. Yeah, there is more tension in the variation that I played than in the variation with e4. The variation with e4 like takes your energy and uses it to do something concrete, and then there's like direct moves going on, whereas this other variation preserves your advantages longer, so there's more of this like tension and what is going to come out of these advantages. And in general, one of the biggest differences about how lower rated players play than higher rated players play is their tolerance, or their tolerance for tension, how much tension they leave in a position, okay? Like strong players leave a lot of tension, and weaker players, like if two pieces are facing each other for a while, they just trade. They get nervous, they don't want to calculate it every turn, they just trade or run away from the trade, but they don't leave the tension in the same way that master games have all this tension building for a long, long time. It's also easier to evaluate a concrete position. It's easier to evaluate what is black's advantage in this position here where, where we eventually win this pawn, that's easier to evaluate than what is black's advantage in like this position here, right? And people go for things that they can evaluate, right? If you have two choices between two lines, and maybe they're each equally good for you, but one of them has like a lot of tension and the other is like simple and clear, well, in general, people go for the one that is like simpler and easier to assess. The exception to that being when you have a bad position and you start moving into more of a desperation mode, then everyone tends to be more willing to go for something unclear over something where it's like, okay, super obvious, I'm down a piece and the queen's got traded and I'm going to resign eventually, right? But yeah, in general, stronger players are embracing the tension and weaker players are avoiding the tension only because of like lack of confidence or, just trying to make themselves more comfortable psychologically. So it also impedes your development and your learning. So I would encourage you in general to try out the very positions that you're afraid of or that have too much tension or you feel uncomfortable. I mean, if you feel uncomfortable because warning bells are going off, like I'm going to get mated, don't play that variation, right? Don't play into the variations that your body is telling you you're going to get destroyed in. But you should experiment with positions that your instinct is, it might be fine, but it's tense and you don't know what it is. You should play into those positions and start discovering what truths lie in there that you don't know about yet. All right, continuing on with this game here. Bishop f4 is played. Again, for white, I would just be trading, guys. And then maybe even play bishop b5 here to try and help me establish dark square control. Because also, like, if I play knight e2, where does my bishop go? So maybe play, like, bishop b5. I have a feeling that Mr. Ning wanted to castle queenside. He's pretty much told us that, so I'm assuming he would do that. And then I would play here for white. This is what I would try and do for white. I think black's still fine because, you've got a space advantage and you can put some pressure on f2. But I think that white is, like, surviving a bit better than in some other options that you had, Mr. Ning. So it's not like you were doing something that was bad or you were misevaluating whether or not you were giving yourself a good position, but you haven't, like, maximized it here. Okay, so after he plays bishop f4, now he takes queen d6 and queen d2 and castles queenside. So now you're nicely ahead in development. You've got this weakness to attack. But my guess would be that from here, you're not going to take advantage of your position as strongly as you can. I can kind of like predict this already. As long as you're not like a strong master, you're very unlikely to prosecute this position with proper energy. In general, people don't play energetically enough. In this position, what's the first move you want to look at in this position? The first move to look at is e3. Why is that? Why is that like the crux of the position? Why is that the first move that pops into my head? The first move that would pop into almost any master's head. D4 is fine too. D4 is a very good secondary candidate move. Yeah, you're trying to open lines, right? Their king is on e1. And they're behind in development on top of that, right? They can't just like castle in one move and everything's equal. Even if they castle in one move on the queen side, you're still going to have a lead in activity here, right? So what you want to look at are d4 and e3, basically, are like the first two moves you look at. Okay? Then depending on how that goes, you might find like, oh, I want to first play knight h5, threatening queen f4 to get out of this. And then once they play G3, then I play E3 because now I have this variation. Okay? So you might look at E3 and D4 and neither of them might be right, but they will help point you to what you need to do. And you're like, oh yeah, because of that variation, I need to play knight H5 first. Okay? So I'm not saying that these moves are going to be the best moves, but I'm saying these are like the crux of the position. 9 times out of 10, one of them will be the right move with the amount of development lead you have here. 9 times out of 10. And the other 1 time out of 10, they'll point you to the right move. So that's what you need to be looking at. And wrong moves to look at are A6, king to B8. Even like rook F8 or rook HE8, which are like the next best moves, are the wrong moves to start looking at. Here's the thing. Let's say you look at E3, D4, and knight H5, and none of them work. None of them are any good, which isn't true. One of them is great. Probably all 3 of them. But just bear with me for a moment. Imagine that you look at D4, E3, and knight H5, and none of them are good. Then, having looked at those moves, you'll probably know whether to play rook HE8 or rook HF8, and then you can play that move in 1 second without ever having looked at it. Okay? Now, imagine you use the opposite thought process. You look at this position and you start calculating rook HF8 and rook HE8. Okay. A, those moves don't particularly lend themselves to calculation. B, how are you going to decide between those 2 moves? C, is looking at either of those moves going to help you suddenly realize that D4 is crushing? Do you think? Do you think that rook Hf8 and suddenly you're going to be like, oh yeah, I can play D4 here and it's really good because of this thing I saw in the rook F8 line? No, the rook F8 line is only going to discourage you. It's only going to show you like white sort of slightly catching up in development and not getting killed. So then you'll never go and look at the moves that try to kill him. Right? So you have to look at the killer moves first. If they don't work for some reason, it may point you to what the setup move is that you need to make. Right? So you always need to start with that. We could spend a bunch of time analyzing and find out which one is better, but honestly, that's not what Mr. Ning needs to learn from this game, so I'm actually going to not do it. I'm going to hold myself off on that, and we're not going to analyze a bunch of variations. You don't need right now to know how to calculate all these variations or need me to tell you which one is better and why. What you need is you need to, when you see a position like this, recognize to look at these moves. That's the number 1 lesson from this thing here, I think. Okay? Recognizing when it's time to go aggressive. I know lurking in you, there's definitely some serious aggression because you played F6 on move 2. And you weren't afraid to put your knight here in a queen pawn opening, blocking your c pawn. You're wanting to play e5. You play with your f pawn. You've got Black Redeemer in your soul. So I know it's not that you're not aggressive. You do want to be aggressive. But I think what you need is some calibration on when can you go aggro and how to do that. Right? When do I want you to play a move like knight f6, shoring up your weakness? Right? When do I want you to make a pawn thrust? Or when do I want you to just castle? Right? That kind of thing. And when should you start looking at like the killer move d4? Right? Because there's a time for each of these things. Right? There's a time to defend your center. There's a time to castle. There's a time to open the position. There's a time to sack. And I think you just need to calibrate that a little bit more. Like, how much buildup do you want to do before you start looking at the killer moves? And which moves do you look at first, right? Like, do you look at e4 first and then decide to castle? Or do you look at castling first and then decide to play e4? Right? All right, so turn. That's what you want to think about and learn from this. And I hope that I've already given you some help in that timing calibration. I think that's already like a good enough lesson for you, and maybe we should go on to the next game of the next player, honestly, because that should give you plenty to think about. That's like one of the cruxes of this game. I'm sure a lot of other things happened, but that was definitely important. I mean, you played a6, which gave them 1 tempo. They should now castle queenside or play knight g2, but they played a developing move that didn't help them fight for these squares or their king's safety. I don't even know what they were going to play next, right? Like, if they're playing bishop e2 instead of castling queenside, is that because they want to castle kingside? If they want to castle kingside, where's their knight going? So they play one more really illogical move, and now you play d4. And now, presumably, you're just thrashing white at this point. You know, it looks like queen a3 already wins. So you've got a lot of good moves here. All right.